Welcome to the Lake Forest Podcast, a podcast about the lovely city of Lake Forest, featuring topics like local news, sports, music, people, food, and history. My name is Pete, and I'm joined by co-host Lake Forest history legend Arthur Miller. We all live in Lake Forest. But before we start our class, we have a sponsor for the show, Dakota Insurance Group. They've got your back. Why? Because that's what friends are for. Dakota Insurance Group handles all your residential and commercial insurance needs. Get its quote now at dakotainsuranceGroup.com. Okay, one of the goals of the podcast is for listeners to learn just a little bit more about Lake Forest. Well, who better to teach us about Lake Forest history than our own Lake Forest history legend, Arthur Miller? Okay, everyone, take your seats, fold your hands, put them on top of the desk. Our class is about to begin. Hey, Art, how you been?
I've been just great. How about you?
Oh, finally we got back from our tour bus, parked it, put it away for the winter.
Yeah.
It's getting cold. So we're back inside for class. What you got in store for us?
So I thought I would try to help sort it out for people that live in Lake Forest about where the different kinds of historic districts that we have. We have national districts, we have local districts. The districts have different names, and then we have national landmarks and local landmarks, and sort them through that, and maybe mention kind of how some of that, especially the landmark ones, came about, mostly since 1998 when there was a change in the ordinance. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. What happened with the ordinance in 1998? I wasn't here.
Okay, well, there had been, going back, there's been planning all through the 20th century, getting more and more structured, but there were beginning to be challenges to the legality of some of the things that people were requiring. So the city of Lake Forest had redid an ordinance for historic properties, for historic districts, that would better implement management, sort of shaping what the historic districts would do as they changed and evolved. Lake Forest nobody wanted it to be a museum where nothing changed, but they wanted to be able to manage how that change took place. And so the ordinance put up about 17 different kinds of criteria that are used to evaluate different kinds of changes that people might want to make within a district, especially within a district. And in a historic district that was a local historic district. And
so this would be like over by the library and whatnot?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the controversies going on over in that direction have to do with the first original Lake Forest in mid-70s, the Lake Forest, they call it the Lake Forest Historic District. It was, it started at Market Square and the train station, but it mostly went east over the lake and then up to the cemetery and that area on Lake Road, and then down along Illinois Road and that sort of thing to that. It gerrymandered around some of the support community housing, which might have been controversial a little bit, but basically they were recognizing that in the period, especially from the period 1860 to probably around 1930, you had this major estate building that went on here that was pretty durable. The houses were built to last, and they were, and we're talking mostly about houses. They were originally, Lake Forest was started out as a millionaires community, so they were impressive mansions from the early days. And then in the after the 1893 World's Fair, they became very much much more formal and permanent, made out of masonry and things like that rather than wood frame. After the Owensia Club was started in 1895, the Owensia Club members built there along on the east side, And then they also built up and down Green Bay Road. So by 1995, there was another historic district for Green Bay Road created. And there was a small National Register district south of downtown with Oakwood and Vine and a little bit of North Green Bay Road that was more smaller community buildings that were put up at that time. So in 1998, when they passed that ordinance, they took in all of these districts into and made them local districts that were managed by the 17 criteria. So if someone wanted to make an alteration to their place, if they had an historic place or any place in the districts, they had to go to the city and to the Historic Preservation Commission to have those changes reviewed. And there, for instance, if you had a house that was an old house that was maybe built in 1880, and it was pretty much as it had been, it was called considered a contributing structure for the district. If you had a house that was built in 1880, but you put a big different front on it, so that it looked entirely different, that was considered a non-contributing structure. Also, if in your front yard you sold it off and somebody put up a house in 1928 or 58, that was non-contributing. So all those different kinds of places had different kinds of importance to people as they went ahead. Mostly it was to protect the historic contributing structures and to govern also the ones around them so that they didn't obliterate those more important places or crowd them or be bigger than or anything like that, so that those places stood out. And that almost sort of set off also a generation of writing books about the places that were there, so that a whole bunch of volumes, coffee table books and other books about the houses and their gardens, probably a shelf of 15 or 20 books came out in the next 25 years that have helped explain why those places are significant. Green Bay Road, the east side of Lake Forest, and behind Green Bay Road, streets like Onwencia Road, Laurel Avenue, few things like that. Those streets had places on it. Pembroke Road, I think, is another one that has a historic house on it that used to be considered Green Bay Road. So that was really what was behind those. So people get confused and they make jokes about it in places like Winnetka. Like there's a joke about the woman who moved to Winnetka from Lake Forest and she wanted to change the doorknob in her front door. And she called the city of, or the village of Winnetka offices and said, I want to change my doorknob. Who do I talk to? And they went, huh? You know, it's a local joke, okay. In Lake Forest, what it amounts to is that if you're going to alter your place, they want to confer with you about it so that it maintains its basic historic character. Another little additional factor of this is, probably by now, 100 or so houses in Lake Forest have given facade easements. You know what those are? No. Okay.
What are those, Art?
So facade easements means that you can work with an organization like Landmarks Illinois, which is a preservation outfit, that will take over custodianship of the way the outside of your house looks. And they will then, in exchange for that, that's giving them property in effect. You're giving them part of your property, and you get, supposing you just cashed in all your chips on all the money you made on GameStop and everything last year, and your taxes look pretty rough. You can take in a one swell foop, tax deduction for giving away this easement on your property. Now the trouble is, if you decide that you've got historic windows from like 1892 on your house, and after a couple years after you did this, you would like to change those to plastic window frames or fiberglass or something else or aluminum, the owner of that facade easement will go, no way. They will say you can't make that change because you agreed to leave your house in that outer part, or a part that's seen mostly by the public. You agreed to leave that unchanged and to maintain it as it was. So you could be unhappy with what you found out later. For things that are really practical, they usually will work with people. Like there's a very important house in town that was subdivided in the 1950s, I think. And they subdivided the garage off, or the carriage house off from the main house. And that left the people with no garage, or just a little dinky garage. So the people wanted to add a new garage that was a little bit more appropriate to their house and maybe even connected a little bit to the house. Well, they had trouble. They went with one architect, it didn't work. They went with it. Finally, they found an architect who worked with the people that owned the facade easement, the Landmarks, Illinois, and they came up with a suitable, appropriate way to do that. But it takes a little more work around that. So you have the National Register, local register, district, local register being governed by these 17 points of scale, style, materials, things like that. And then if you have a facade easement, which many of the most important places now do, then you would also be working with those people to make changes. A lot of people coming to Lake Forest know that they're buying an old house. There's one that's going to be on the cover of the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation's periodical that goes out to all the householders next week, I think, or next couple of weeks. It's got a house on it. The people bought the house. There'd been previous owner who put a facade easement on it, and they just remodeled the inside of it and then did some maintenance work on the outside of it, but didn't change the look of what it had been before. So new people coming in are realizing that this is part of what you do when you get one of these old Lake Forest houses. It's like buying a listed house in Great Britain or something like that, where it's protected by structures the government or somebody oversees. In this case, it's a combination of government oversight and then this not-for-profit Landmarks Illinois oversight. So that's kind of what it is. Now, what's the advantage of doing this? The disadvantage is obvious. You got to, if you want to change something, you got to work through a bunch of people. The advantage is your neighbor also has to work through all these people before he changes it. So all of a sudden, he's not going to put a Ferris wheel up next to your house.
Art, can I ask a question in class?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. Now, I'm on the caucus committee, and our job is to recruit people for the various boards. And one of the positions we're looking to fill is the HPC board.
Yes.
Is that part of these people that you're talking about? The historical
committee of people, and they come from a combination of people who know a lot, have served on different boards, like the new chairman, the interim chairman, who's Maureen Grinnell. She's been on both or I guess her husband's been on the Historical Society board. She's been on the Ragdale Foundation board, which maintains some old buildings over on Upper Green Bay Road. And she's been on the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation board. So she knows all this stuff as well as anybody in town. And there are a couple other people on the board who do also. But then there are maybe newer ones who don't know as much. And what they're assuming is that if you live in Lake Forest, you kind of have a sense of what looks good here. And if somebody tells you, like it's on Sesame Street, they used to have these things where they would have like 4 things in a row, and which of these things does not look like the others? If you could pass Sesame Street, you can probably intuitively sort out a lot of these kind of things. And
If I want new doorknobs, do I have to go to Sesame Street? Like, what's the
no, but
okay?
not a doorknob. But if you, let's say you wanted to change your entry in some way,
Okay.
they would probably try to have you keep it as much as it is in its historic character. I'm not sure they'd notice a doorknob, but they don't want to have people making kind of renovations on the front of their house when it's an important historic house that was done by an architect. So that sort of thing. So there's a level of common sense about what you bring to them and what you don't bring to them.
Okay. But who decides what goes in front of them? I'm just curious.
You call it, if you're in doubt, you would call the city department of development.
Okay.
And you tell them what you want to do. If, let's say, you just wanted to do maintenance on your front porch or something like that, they would say, okay, or you're going to change the way it looks. Well, let's talk about it a little bit, and maybe then it would go to the Historic Preservation Commission.
Okay.
But if you're keeping things pretty much the same, I'm not sure that would happen. If you wanted to repaint, in the old days with these fancy houses that were built 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, they hired an architect when they had their house painted to make sure it was done right. Everything was overseen.
An architect for painting?
Yeah, because they didn't want some Yahoo to screw it up.
Okay.
They were works of art. They were built as works of art. And that's where you come to the basic point about these things being protected. They were built as art objects, but they were exterior surface art objects, interior art objects. And that's the problem with the library. It really is, and for people in town especially that know about it, the building is an art object. It's something that's very rare for its type, and its interiors and its exteriors, and most of these, the Historic Preservation Commission only looks at the exteriors, doesn't deal with interiors. It's all about the exterior. So you could gut the inside of your house and turn it into a big birdhouse if you wanted to, as long as it, as long as it looked the same on the outside from the streetscape. Because the concern is the historic streetscapes as we drive along the streets, that everything is compatible. Compatible is another word for harmony, visual harmony, which was one of the values of the period, kind of classical harmony. So that's it. Now the different ones we have, as I said, was the East District, the Oakwood District, and then later was added the Green Bay Road District. That Green Bay Road District, it also had some houses that were built in the 30s and stuff and later, some even in the 40s and 50s that would now be covered. After something is 50 years old, it becomes historic, and it can be a contributing structure. Before it's 50 years old, it's not historic, and it might be going to be contributing, but it's not yet contributing. I think there might be one or two exceptions in town where they granted contributing status to a place that wasn't as old, but because of its significance, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time they wait for 50 years. And so the HPC deals with those kinds of issues. Now, after that, some districts were added that were National Register districts. They worked through the state to create them as districts, but they didn't, the constitutional thing that didn't turn them into being an actual National Register district. A key one I'll notice there is the West Park District. That's around West Park, which is on Green Bay Road. And Howard Van Dornshaw designed a neighborhood to the east of that on the old Atteridge Farm from 1830 that had a lot of builders' houses. He didn't design the houses, he laid out the streets, but they're all pretty much of a type and of a period. around 1907 to 12, and with some infill later. But basically, that was. But then when they had it put it to a vote to all the people in the district, 95% of them wanted it to be an historic district. But there was a former mayor that lived in the neighborhood who did not want it to be an historic district. And out of deference to that mayor, the city would not vote on it to make it that way. Now, it's still, even though it's a National Register district, it's still, then because of that, it's still, people have respected it a great deal. There hasn't been anything unfortunate happen inside that district since that became a National Register district. But it's not protected in the same way that the ones inside the historic districts are. It doesn't have the same level of review. So now, if you want to see some of the ways that things are different, along the lakefront, for instance, these houses that were built first along the lakefront, there probably were a bunch of wooden places that were built. Well, being close to the lake, wooden places rot out super fast, as my folks found out that owned one on the other side of the lake.
Oh.
So they didn't last really that long. A lot of them would last just maybe even 20 to 50 years, something like that. And so a lot of those houses along the bluff in the historic district are the second or third house that were built on their sites. But they were built to be permanent. They decided no more of this cheap materials on the exterior. We're going to build these things like forts. So the famous house at 1315 North Lake Road, it's a kind of mica stone with little shiny stones. And we look at the rocks that are there, Pennsylvania style colonial house. That's a mere cottage. It's 34,000 square feet. You could probably find rooms for your stuff in there.
Some.
So that house, that's been there since 1931, and it's really solid. But that's an example of one of the permanent houses that were built. There are a few frame houses still surviving near the lake. One is at 255 North Mayflower Road. You can't really see it from the road, but it's an early Howard Van Doren Shaw, 1897 or so, 98, colonial revival house. It's been carefully restored a couple times, but let's say that it's not the cheapest building to maintain because it's frame. Most of the ones that are lasting are having, they're having a lot of masonry on them someplace or another, And so David Adler, Harry T. Lindeberg, Howard Van Doren Shaw, Walter Fraser, who was another one of those architects from that period. These are the kind of architects who mostly built those buildings. Stanley Anderson built some. So these are major architects, national. Howard Van Doren Shaw was the first architect to be recipient of the gold medal of the American Institute of Architects, first Midwestern architect, I should say. In 1926-27, he got that. Before then, it had always been East Coast guys. He was the first one to have a practice in Chicago, Midwest. David Adler was declared for an article in a book about the exhibit at the Art Institute on David Adler in 2002 that he was the leading architect of his generation, which was a little after Shaw. So, these were people who were nationally the top figures in their era. And so these houses have been protected. And that doesn't mean that they don't still there aren't alterations made. One of Shaw's houses is under construction now to take it back to a little bit more like what it looked like when Shaw had built it 100 years ago or 105 years ago, something like that. So there's a lot of that sort of thing goes on. But it explains some of the brouhaha about what's been going on at the far eastern end of that district, where there's been discussions and people back and forth about what's going to go into the historic district, how that's going to be changed, addition on the library, a building just north of there that's been under discussion. So this is the concern, that people want to follow those 17 points and respect the buildings around them, to respect the historic structures around them with whatever goes on. So nothing is ever crystal clear. So there's often discussion about it. Often things will go in for a hearing with the people. There'll be a review. They'll talk it over. And then they will maybe come up with some suggestions and ask the people to come back the next time. And sometimes these come back 2 or 3 times before they're approved. It sounds arcane to some people. It sounds ridiculous. It also builds in a lot of value to whatever gets built. If you're renovating a home versus building a new one, a lot of the cost, regardless of it's historic or not, is in the architectural planning, not just in the materials, because you need to plan it so that it'll work for your house. So there's a lot of architectural work involved in making it work. And as subdivisions take place, and the places fill in, usually too, the last house built has got the toughest job because it's got all the other ones it's got to fit in with. If you're the first one in a group of houses, nobody really minds too much. But if you're the last guy, you get in trouble. So
Art, if you have HPC, you have planning, and you have zoning.
What are the differences?
Yeah, how does that all play together? I don't expect you to have all the answers. I'm just curious.
Well, zoning review, there's the zoning review board. The plan commission would probably come up with the basic zoning ideas. So each part of town would have a type of assignment, whether it's how big of a lot for a residential place, whether it's a 2-family place, a small residential, medium-sized residential. These are all set aside. And then in each case, they would also have a setback. And the zoning people get involved a lot. The zoning review board gets involved a lot on the setbacks, because people will feel crowded in the space that's allotted for development on their property, and how close they're going to be to their neighbor.
What is the setback, Art?
Setback would be, if let's say you own a property that's 100 by 75 feet. Well, on those sides that are the 100, you might have a setback of 10 feet. At the front of the house, the 75, you might have a setback of 50 feet or 40 feet or something like that. So if you want to wiggle into those other spaces with construction, you have to go to the zoning review board. Now, they're governed by state law, and they're pretty tough. They're simply, and it's much more of a legal sounding thing. You have to be sworn in to testify at it. But the plan commission sets up initially what are the overall ground rules for how the things are going to be distributed. Not the design of what the buildings are going to look like, but how much scale of development, how much space there's going to be around it, that sort of thing. And one of the things that's unique about Lake Forest as you go north on the North Shore, as we saw, was that there's a lot more open space around buildings and just on the roadways, on the streetscapes. As you drive in Lake Forest, as you drive in, you don't see hardly anything until you get onto Sheridan Road, or you get into downtown Lake Forest. You're mostly running along wooded portions of the street. You don't see much at all. It's behind that you have the developments and things like that. West Lake Forest, even more so. Now, one way you can see the difference between what it means to have the protected area on the east side on the lakefront and not is to go south of the protected area in Lake Forest. There you would go out on Wesley Road, probably. If you go Wesley Road, clear over toward the lake, on the north of that, there is something called Bluffs Edge Road. You can go down Bluffs Edge Road, and there are a bunch of places facing the lake. Almost all of those houses have been torn down in the last 10 years and replaced. Now, I'm not commenting about whether the house before was any good or if the house that's going up is better or worse. That's not the point. They're different. They're entirely different. There's one house that was built on a subdivision. That's all part of the former Walden estate of Cyrus McCormick. There's one house where there's an overlook that there was for that estate. It's got a house from the 1962 on there. And that's been added to, but it's been added to fairly sympathetically. Otherwise, it's been just smash and start over. If you go south of that on Circle Lane, Circle Lane starts out without really having a lakefront. There's an estate or two there, but then you go curling down and you go to near where the old Villa Turcum house was. And there are 1, 2, 3 houses that have been torn down and replaced in the last at least 15 years, I would say, if not 10 years, 15 years. They've been completely smashed and started up again. There was, in one place, they tore down in about 2010, a 1998 masonry house that I gave a speech in a living room that would hold 110 people. So that lakefront land is a premium, It was a
100
masonry
people.
built in 1988, and they just, boom, gone. So those rules are much less strict about those kind of landscapes there along in the southern part. And that would have happened to some extent a whole bunch more up that lakeshore. And so Lake Forest historic, the feeling what you get if you drive down Lake Road or something like that, that would be gone if we hadn't put in that, if that district hadn't gone in. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't have been great houses, but these really solid places from when they were built as art objects, not just as big houses, but as art objects, they would all be lost. And that's the bottom line. If you drive down Green Bay Road and you see the places on Green Bay between Wesley and, let's say, up at the city line and up at Lake Bluff, you see a whole bunch of places that were built in that period that are really pretty significant. And they're turning over now. People are buying them. I think the Two Gables, the Mr. T house is just sold, I heard.
Yeah.
People want these places. The people from outside of here think they're tremendous bargains. They're coming from, the coast where a house like that would cost 25 million or so, and they're picking them up for, 5 or 10 million, and they can't believe it. They're pinching themselves, So they're great places for in the summertime, great beach here in Lake Forest. So that's basically the situation of these historic districts and why we have them and how they're administered. We have a very small staff at the city that works with people to make those things happen. They'll outsource historic studies sometimes on places if they're not sure what to do. But basically, it's a few city employees, a couple of folks that really manage the Historic Preservation Commission, the Plan Commission, Zoning Review Board, and the Building Review Board, which oversees in a less strict manner the houses outside the historic districts.
Art, these people that come in and buy up the properties, it's no secret that Lake Forest is, I don't say stringent, but I mean, you got a lot of hoops to go through. It's not a secret, right?
Well, and see, that's good because then people, like if they make a joke about it in Winnetka,
Yeah.
and somebody wants more space and they come up to Lake Forest, they've already heard that, they're careful up there. The advantages and the disadvantages are the same thing. I mean, you want to make a little change at your place, you got to do something. But your stupid neighbor next door or across the street, he's got to do the same thing. He can't encroach on you by building something taller or wider or funny looking.
Well, the people that are buying in and and then they complain after they buy, they know that it's tough to get stuff done here, right? It shouldn't be a secret, right?
I'm assuming that most of these people that are in business, if they haven't heard the word due diligence someplace,
Yeah.
In their business school career or something like that, it wouldn't take, you don't have to really dig very deeply to find out this sort of stuff. And so there are less and less of those people. There were more of them earlier, I would say, a decade or so ago. But now most people are coming up here. They know what they're coming for, and they're coming for the protection and the privacy that you get here, in those areas. So, and so people that go onto the boards and commissions are doing they're protecting their community. The political notion after the pandemic, when everybody's just had it, it's like I had a friend in college who in his room had a cockatoo that had been raised at Woolworths, the five and dime,
Yeah.
That bird was very nervous, He'd been locked up in Woolworths with kids poking through the thing and everything. He was the nervousest looking bird I ever saw. And that's what people are like after this pandemic. They've been caged and people are poking them. And they're poking back.
We got to be free.
Yeah. So, I think it's a rough time, but if people will go onto these boards, there's a lot of pressure on all of us to maintain civility, to make our points without being disrespectful or inconsiderate of other people. The volunteers are getting no funding out of it, but they're serving their community, they're protecting their community, and we should give them our thanks.
And we need some more volunteers. We're looking for HPC people, Art. Pass the word.
I encourage people, and you shouldn't be worried that you don't understand everything at first. This is the little primer here, but it makes more sense as you get into it. And as you sit through a few meetings, you look at a few packets. At the first time you look at one of those packets, it's going to look like, because they come out every month about 120 pages. It's like reading, War and Peace. But after a while, you get so that you know where to go to see what you want to see, and bang, you know what you need to know. So people get better at reading that stuff. You just have to allow yourself a little patience and not be afraid that you'll make some mistakes or say something stupid at the front. There is nothing stupid about being a private citizen who's volunteering to help people in your community and to maintain your community. And so you'll learn your ropes and you'll get in there. And I just encourage everybody who has the opportunity to accept an invitation to be on the HPC, and that they'll benefit from it.
And if they want an invitation, Pete at Jansons.com, Pete at lakeforestpodcast.com. Say you want to get on, I will bring you in for an interview.
Exactly. Very good. Okay.
Art, thank you for making me just a little bit smarter about Lake Forest.
You know so much now, right?
I am less dumb.
Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about this.
Thank you, Art. Thanks for listening to the Lake Forest Podcast. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and smash that like button on Facebook, Instagram, and follow us on Twitter. Let us know what you'd like to hear about in the upcoming shows. Again, I'm Pete, and can be reached at Pete at lakeforestpodcast.com. The link will be in the podcast notes. On behalf of my co-host, Arthur Miller, we thank you for listening. Our class is now over. Ring the bell, cue the band.